Stats in Throne of Liberty look simple at a first glance, but in reality there are hidden formulas and stats that affect each of the visible stats. Knowing which stats to maximize and which stats to avoid is crucial when building your endgame character and can save you a lot of lucent and time. In this video I will go over each stat, how they work, how it is calculated, and which stats should certain weapons maximize. The main stat points are earned through leveling. When upon reaching level 50, you will have 49 stat points to spend in 4 different categories. Each of the 4 categories has a point threshold on 30, 40, 50 and 60 stat points spent, which gives additional bonuses. These stats can also be increased through gear, so knowing which 2 main stats are for your build will make it easier when gearing up your endgame character. Strength affects base damage, health regen, max health, melee defense and range defense. Dexterity affects base damage, attack speed, critical hit and evasion. Wisdom affects base damage, max mana, mana regen and cooldown speed, and perception affects base damage, hit and buff duration. This is the most basic form of stat distribution. The stats on the top and right side of your stats menu are all easily understandable and self-explanatory when hovering over each of them, so I won't waste your time explaining each of them as these stats don't have any hidden formulas. You're mostly interested in attack and protection stats. Before starting, I have to give credit to Eli and his team who spent a lot of time testing and figuring out these formulas. First we have hit and evasion. These 2 stats interact with one another by having a counter effect. This is the hidden formula that lets you calculate your evasion chance, and the way it works is like this. If you have equal or less evasion than enemy hit, you will have 0% evasion chance. If you have 500 more evasion than enemy hit, you will have 33% evasion chance. And if you have 1000 more evasion than enemy hit, you will have 50% evasion chance. Evasion is a stat that gives you a chance to completely dodge an attack, whether it's damage or CC, but only if you have more evasion than an enemy has hit. Otherwise, it does absolutely nothing. That's why you need to stack evasion high, as it is not worth having in small numbers. The only 2 weapons that should stack evasion are daggers and sword and shield. Dagger have a passive that gives around 700 range and magic evasion when using mobility attacks for 6 seconds. While sword and shield also has a passive that gives smaller amounts of range and magic evasion. Combine these passives with stacked ranged and magic evasion through gear and traits, and you have a very decent evasion chance against every DPS class. Hit is a stat that every DPS class should build and aim for around 800 to 900. Critical hit and endurance are the 2 stats that also interact with one another by having a counter effect. This is the hidden formula that lets you calculate your crit chance, and the way it works is like this. If you have an equal or less critical hit than enemy has endurance, you have 0% crit chance. If you have 500 more critical hit than the enemy has endurance, you have 33% critical chance. And if you have 1000 more critical hit than the enemy has endurance, you have 50% critical chance. Critting means that you do max base damage on an attack, which is indicated by a bigger orange number on your screen. This is where the base damage range comes into play, as the higher your max damage is, the more damage you will crit, and if you don't crit, then it's an RNG between a min and max range of your base damage. The damage is even more amplified when you have crit damage. It's a stat only found in weapon passives and gear set bonuses. If you have 250 max damage and you crit with 20% crit damage, you deal 300 damage. Every DPS should build at least 1000 critical hit. Now endurance is a stat that counters critical hit, and it is better the more you stack it, just like evasion is. In reality, endurance is worse than evasion, because if you have more endurance than the enemy has critical hit, you will still take a smaller amount of damage and you can still be CC'd, but they can never crit you. If you can't stack evasion with passives, then stacking endurance is your next best option. Heavy attack chance and heavy attack evasion also counter each other, but in different ways. This is the formula for calculating a heavy attack chance, and it works like this. It basically gives you a double damage, which is indicated by a ×2 next to your damage number. The stat is very hard to stack and come by, as it mostly comes from traits, several passives and some gear, but every chance you can get to add an extra few heavy attack chance, you should take it. Heavy attack evasion is unfortunately a stat that is only obtainable through passive guild buff, when controlling a castle or a boonstone, and through runes. But it works the same way as endurance, where the enemy has a lower percent chance for a heavy attack on you. This is the formula for skill damage boost and resistance. Skill damage boost is a stat that mainly comes from traits on necklace and 2 rings, while skill damage resistance comes from cloak, belt and bracelet. Both of these stats can also be found in runes. Both of them are multipliers for damage done and damage taken, and they also affect skill heal. 120% skill damage boost, for example, is 11% skill damage increase. It is very important to build skill damage boost stat early on, even on green accessories, and you should only start moving to blue and purple accessories once you're comfortable you can build up enough skill damage boost stats on them. Bonus damage is a stat that adds on to every damage point you do. For example, if you have 50 bonus damage, a skill that does 1000 damage will do 1050 damage. But a skill that does 5 times 300 damage will do 5 times 350 damage. So with this, bonus damage is only good for weapons and builds that can do fast multiple attacks, which at this point is only crossbow. Damage reduction is a stat that tanks stack. Their counter barrier damage scales off of damage reduction stat, meaning the more you have, the more damage you can reflect back to the attackers. The stat reduces a flat amount at the end of the damage formula, meaning it will make you more tankier. Buff duration increases the duration of buffs on you, including buffs from other players. Sword and shield and crossbow players want to stack this up as much as possible, while debuff duration reduces the time you are affected by debuffs. No DPS build should focus on stacking debuff duration, as you lose other valuable stats, but tanks should stack this as much as possible, seeing as they are almost always frontline in PvP fights. This is the formula for defense stat. It's a stat that simply reduces base damage from all attacks, and it can be found on all gear pieces and accessories. Heavy armor has more melee and ranged, while leather and cloth has less. This is the formula for chance versus resistance stat, and it works like this. You have a base weaken chance of 20%, and if the enemy has 250 more weaken resistance, he lowers your weaken chance by 50%. So now your weaken chance is 10%. But if you have 250 more weaken chance than the enemy resistance, now that 20% weaken chance becomes 60%. This one is a bit complicated to understand, but the general idea is that when possible you should build resistance, while naturally you have a base chance of 300. Now that you understand how all these important stats work and their hidden formulas, it is time to learn how traits work. Which of these stats you should build on each gear piece, and which are the most effective traits long term. To learn more about them, click on the video on your screen.